Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for dialing in to our webinar on the Task Force for Climate-Related Risk Disclosures. So I'm delighted to be welcoming Russell Pico here this morning to talk to you. Before I do that, I wanted to do firstly a little bit of housekeeping, and then secondly a bit of an introduction to the Resource and Environment Board ourselves. So if you could keep your phones on mute, and if you would like to submit questions, please either use the chat box in the app, or if you've dialed in, send questions to Rebecca. We will try and pick those up as we go. So last Friday, Friday the 12th of May, we issued a risk alert to all of our members discussing the materiality of climate change, and saying that this is an issue that actuaries should consider whether it comes into their advice or not. This is really the result of work that we've been doing in the Resource and Environment Board. We are a practice area board who are dedicated to making resource and environment issues mainstream, and principally amongst those is climate change. Now, the Resource and Environment Board practice area is a new field. We're looking to grow the role of actuaries in the resource and environment area, as well as producing research to support actuaries in traditional fields to explore climate change issues. If you would be interested in finding out more about the Resource and Environment Board practice area, please do sign up to our newsletter. If you go onto your login on the actuary's website, you can find a link to sign up to the newsletter. So today we're here to talk, to listen to Russell as he talks about the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Russell has a number of different roles. So Russell is the chair of the HSBC Bank Pension Fund. He's a trustee director of LifeSight, which is Willis Towers Watson's master trust, and of course he is a special advisor to the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So over to you, Russell. What does the Task Force and the TCFD mean to you?
And this is unashamedly not trying to be the 401st carbon disclosure framework. For us, it's about making climate risk a mainstream business subject of conversation, and in many ways the single most important achievement we may yet manage to achieve is to actually get this subject on the agenda of boards right across the world and right through all aspects of business life, because the reality is this will affect pretty much every single business, and it will affect fund managers, it will affect the banks, it will affect the insurance companies, it will affect the asset owners, the pension schemes, and of course it will present opportunities as well as risks. And that's certainly true for the investment consulting industry, as I imagine a number of you are very interested. So let me now drill into a little bit of the background about how did we come to be formed. This very much was the brainchild of Governor Mark Carney, who has a very strong personal conviction that climate risk represents a significant potential threat to the stability of the world's financial system. Many of you will be familiar with the groundbreaking speech he made to Lloyd's of London, and when he coined the phrase "the tragedy of the horizons." And Governor Carney took this issue internationally to the Financial Stability Board, and after going through due process, they decided at the end of 2015 to set up a task force. This was off the back of the previous task force, which I'd co-chaired around bank risk disclosures, which was a private sector initiative, again spawned by the FSB. And we were given two objectives, which are on the slide. First of all, to promote more informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions, and secondly, to enable a better understanding of where carbon-related risks sit within the world's financial system. And as you can see from the map of the world, we have a pretty broad and diverse range of representatives geographically, as well as people from the financial sector and non-financial sector and other experts. And perhaps just a word around the timing, and perhaps one of the great enablers for this task force really was the Paris Agreement at COP21, which for many businesses, I think, moved climate risk from a question of do you believe in the science or not, to almost 200 of countries around the world have committed to take the world on a transition path to a low carbon world, and that is going to affect economic activity right across the world, almost touching almost every single aspect of business life. As with everything with the FSB, it's a little bit like being given homework. You do what you're asked to do and you don't do what you're not asked to do. So one or two people have observed they'd like us to be doing things which are outside our mandate, and I'm afraid, just have to sit firmly within our mandate. That is not to say this is not a very challenging topic. Could I just ask one or two of you, I'm hearing one or two bits of noise.
No, I'm all right, I need to
Go on mute, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So the challenge is, obviously, as everyone will be familiar with, issuers generally have an obligation under existing law to disclose material risk. I think the reality is that there isn't really a coherent framework to do so, and typically this climate risk has landed within the normal province of risk factors, which in turn is where the external corporate reporting councils sit. So in a number of cases, you read about the typical risks a company faces, normal business risks, a meteor hitting the head office building, and then next to that you'll read some fairly boilerplate language around climate risk. I think it is clear that we need a step change in the quality and quantity of narrative and numerical information published by companies to improve the information flow to those within the investment chain who make capital allocation financial decisions, both in the equity markets and in the debt markets. And obviously the regulators need to improve their understanding of whether risks sit within the financial system. Although this task force per se is not trying to actually fix the problem for regulators. That's not the primary purpose of our work. We are unashamedly a private sector task force coming up with a private sector non-binding voluntary disclosure framework for the private sector. That's important, that we have no authority to require anyone to do anything, least of all to set rules and regulations. So what we've tried to do is to come up with recommendations which can be applied to any company in the world and scaled to any level of size and sophistication. We really would like to see this information included in financial filings, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I think because we see this as being potentially a mainstream business risk, our strong preference is for that information to be provided to the markets at the same time as the normal flow of financial information. And secondly, the reality is when companies are asked to make disclosure in their filings, things happen within those companies. Typically, audit committees are involved, scrutinizing the process and the quality of those disclosures. Typically, the chief financial officer is involved, and therefore, almost by definition, this becomes an issue which the board engages with. And we were really, one of the behavioral changes we were seeking to drive was to move this from perhaps a sustainability department, perhaps not sitting within the mainstream business thought in the business, and move it into that. This is a matter for the board to engage with. It's not a peripheral activity. We need to think through this. There are some groundbreaking recommendations which I'll come on to later, particularly recommendations on scenario analysis. And the concept of the investment chain is really at the heart of this. And briefly, the concept of investment chain is that we would like asset owners, so pension schemes, for example, to be recognizing climate risk is present in their portfolio. Not that it's a belief, that it is a mainstream financial risk that they need to assess. And in order to consider how they're going to manage and assess that, they need information. And that typical reaction then from an asset owner will be to ask their fund managers, who they've given mandates to provide information. And of course, the fund managers in turn will put pressure on the companies to produce the information. And that dynamic is really at the heart of the concepts behind the task force recommendations. There is a strong emphasis on business opportunities, which are very considerable in relation to transition as well as risks, and it's important that the task force work has really strived very hard to achieve a unanimity of view, which we've pretty much done, that we haven't had strong differences of view which we haven't been able to resolve. This is a somewhat busy slide, which you can sort of read in your own time. It sets out the typical ladder of risks and opportunities. On the risk side, policy and legal. Clearly, we're seeing the potential for environmental liabilities to be expanded in exposure to litigation. Clearly, there are the normal physical risks which would be associated with real estate and insurance, and opportunities. I think we see a plethora of opportunities in terms of funding new infrastructure, working for energy efficiency of buildings, etc., etc. But we're seeing a lot of interest in the business opportunities which will come from transition to a low carbon world. Another point to make is that, again, this is not primarily a project seeking to expand greenhouse gas emission information. That's there already. It is part of our suite of disclosures. For us, it's really about thinking through the impact on your financial performance, but in the short, medium, and long term, because it, as a risk, will manifest itself depending on your business and depending on your industry, in issues and risks which may arise across that period of time. Particularly, I think we've placed quite a lot of focus on the importance of capital expenditure and investment expenditure, because a business which today perhaps is a high carbon intensive business in a particular industry, but the board concludes it needs to reshape its business strategy and its business model to be fit for a low carbon world, is likely to need funding through debt and equity markets for its capital expenditure. That forward-looking indication of where the company is going to be laying down its capital expenditure is likely to be one of the most important areas for investors, and they need to frame it with an understanding of the strategic context. So moving on to the areas where we've come up with recommendations. First of all, we'd like companies to describe the governance process. We'd like all companies to describe that, and that's asking for an explanation, a narrative around what's the role of the board, how does the board consider this risk, is it delegated to a subsidiary risk committee perhaps, what's the interplay with the senior management committee. So a narrative around that. We think that's a disclosure that all companies should be making. We would like to see, and again, this is a really important disclosure, the company, first of all, to discuss, and then secondly, to share the outcome of those business discussions about the actual and potential impacts of climate risk opportunity on their business, the strategy, and their finances. Thirdly, to then understand the process by which an organization identifies and undertakes its risk management process. And then finally, what metrics and targets are used to manage those risks. This slide then just seeks to build that out, but I perhaps would just focus on a couple of areas. Within the strategy area, right down the bottom of that column, we have landed our scenario analysis recommendation. So this would be a suggested disclosure where a board has concluded that climate risk is a significant risk, and we therefore would like to see the model what a 2-degree transition scenario would look like for that business. To be clear, we're not looking for profit forecasts here. We're looking for strategic shape around business strategy and potential returns. And there are some interesting disclosures already made by some companies around that. Within the metrics and targets, again, this through the eyes of management concept is very important. We'd like the management to describe how it sets targets and metrics for its senior management. We do think there's a place for Scope 1 and, if necessary, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions within that. And when we were thinking about framing these disclosures, I think it was very important that we thought about both the interests of those who are going to use the information, but also the challenges that preparers of these disclosures are facing. So we've tried to come up with disclosures which are proportionate, which are not overly onerous, but which are really fit for purpose. And in the detail in our report, you can actually see us then try and map our disclosure recommendations to existing climate risk disclosure regimes. And I think we're reasonably confident that we're going to see strong harmonization between those frameworks and our work. Just very briefly, the structure of our recommendations, there are certain disclosures which apply to all business sectors, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we've highlighted particular the financial sector because of the investment chain I spoke about earlier, but also a number of non-financial sectors which we believe are potentially most affected by climate change. I will move through these slides reasonably quickly. So moving on then to the analysis of which particular industry sectors we highlighted. So you can see in the top half of this slide the analysis around the investment chain, where we're seeking disclosures from the banks around strategy, around risks and metrics and targets, and then similar disclosures for insurance companies and asset owners and asset managers. And I would stress again, if we are to achieve a step change in quality of disclosure and to achieve the improvement of flow of information to the market so that better quality capital allocation decisions can be made by asset managers and asset owners, we need the chain to operate, and we need the asset owners to be stepping into this issue, not being passive, stepping into it, understanding the techniques which are available to manage this, and calling upon the asset managers and the issuers to be providing the information. And then unsurprisingly, in the non-financials, energy, which obviously would include oil and gas, the transportation sector, which would include shipping, aviation, but also auto manufacturers, materials and buildings, unsurprisingly because energy efficiency of the real estate stock of a country is a national question of how the country will meet its NDCs, and finally agricultural, food and forestry. So you'll see detailed recommendations in these sectors, but again you'll see a really strong alignment between the all sector guidance and the particular nuances for those industries. Moving on to scenario analysis, in many ways this is both the most controversial and the most exciting area of where we're seeking disclosure. We recognise this is groundbreaking. We recognise that this may take time for businesses to think through how they're going to do this. But as I said, what we're looking for is trying to understand the impact of a 2-degree transition scenario on the strategy, the business and financial planning. There are some industries where this has become, I think, part of the normal risk management toolbox. I think there are others where this is very much in its infancy, and I think we expect disclosures to respect that. We're not expecting to suddenly see a raft of lots and lots of disclosure around scenario analysis running ahead of what we think is some investment by businesses to really use this technique. I think we very much think about this as an important and useful risk management tool to enable a board and the senior management to understand the way that climate risk may affect aspects of that company's business, and that's what we're seeking to understand. We recognise there will be some investment needed. I think this is an area where there is perhaps a lack of familiarity, and out of all the areas of our work, it's the area where we've seen the most frequent calls for workshops and for discussions between companies and advisors about how they may be able to achieve this. And just looking forward, we've highlighted a couple of areas where we think there could be further investment. Certainly harmonisation of our work with others. We think that there is a benefit from a data sets and tools and scenario analysis to be made publicly available and provide commonly available information. Getting the data to do a scenario analysis is a fundamental necessity, and for that, those data sets and the tools to be broadened would be really helpful. Where are we going? Well, we've held our final plenary meeting, which we did the other week, and we are firmly on track to issue the final reports to the Financial Stability Board middle of June this year, and then hopefully we're going to see Governor Carney taking our report to the G20 summit on July 7th and 8th in Hamburg. We are hopeful that he will take the report with strong words of encouragement and welcome from the Financial Stability Board and from himself personally. And obviously, perhaps the political sphere is a little more uncertain than the FSB level, but we are still hopeful that we'll see again some warm words of encouragement from the G20. The task force will then continue in existence for about another year. We're not going to be trying to write another report, but really to facilitate and support and monitor adoption right across the world. Finally, the list of members, 32 of us around the world under the chairmanship of Mike Bloomberg. So with that,
thanks very much.
Back to you, Nico.
Thank you. And that was very, very interesting. I'm sure I stimulated a lot of questions from our audience. If there are more questions coming in, please do continue to type them into the chat box or email them to Rebecca. We've had a couple come in already. What evidence have you seen so far on how companies in different sizes and locations are engaging with this process and the recommendations you've made?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So there have been a number of omnibus letters going around, which have been signed by dozens of companies actually, really expressing their support for what the task force is trying to achieve and recognising it's a very important area. I think my sense is, if I was to measure the number of conference agendas that this is appearing on, this is certainly becoming a subject of great interest, as indeed it should. I think we're in the early stages of perhaps seeing this issue being, as I would hope, seeing it turning up on the standard trustee board agenda. I think you obviously do have a number of early movers. If you move outside the United Kingdom, perhaps to a country like the Netherlands, I think they are the major pension schemes in the Netherlands really address this as a matter of course. I think in the UK there are some early movers, but I think we're still in the early stages of that, which is very understandable. And we certainly do understand that many businesses will be on a journey. We're pretty realistic about this. We think it'll take 2 or 3 years for this really to get going. But what we'd like to see is companies starting to address that in their discussions, perhaps initially making narrative disclosure around the governance and perhaps thinking through the strategic recommendations. I think those are useful narrative disclosures, and I think we're going to see strong engagement with the institutional shareholders around that.
Yeah, I think that leads me on to the question that I had, which was you mentioned the desire to make sure that this was proportionate, and of course it also has to liaise with existing definitions of materiality. Mark Carney's first talk was on the tragedy of the horizons, and e.g. that climate change is maybe something that happens too far into the future for a lot of corporate activity to worry too much about. How does this help to extend that horizon? How do you kind of parley those two worldviews?
Yeah, I think clearly there are aspects of climate risk, particularly some of the physical impacts. However, and going back to one of the remarks I said in my opening comments, Nico, I think that the commitment to make this transition to a low carbon world really pulls this forward very, very strongly. I think that brings this issue for some industries, for me, into the short to medium term. Yeah. So I can think of industries which are really thinking this through pretty actively now, because they are having to adapt their business model, and we're going to see changes maybe over the next 3 to 7 years. I think there's a question then around at what point does this drop into equity sell-side analysts' cash flow projections. The typical mechanism is that this will either drop into the terminal value assumptions, or it'll come into the first 5-year cash flow forecasts. I mean, there are pieces of research which I've seen around at what point that might happen. I think equally there are some fundamental questions around how disruptive new technology could be. It just feels to me this is an area where momentum is building. It's actually building very rapidly. Obviously within Paris we have the 3-year stock-taking mechanism, so and we have binding agreements by a number of countries, so you can expect to see important policy announcements. This is almost like a snowball rolling downhill. Yeah. This is just going to build and build and build.
Right. So a question on scenarios. How could you develop a generic tool when all businesses are going to be affected in so many different ways?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, at the heart of this, you're effectively building a model and doing something around cash flows. And if I think about the industry that I came from, Nico, which was the banks, I mean, the banks went through a period of investment in their stress testing tools. And in many ways, this has similarities. I put it no more strongly than that, in that you start off with a narrative, in this case, transition to a 2-degree world or lower temperature. And from that, then you develop economic assumptions, and then you bring those into your business. So I think a company would need to have a model, and it would need to be able to source data and economic assumptions from an external agency. So one of the scenarios out there is the IA 450, and what we're seeing is a very small number, literally a handful of publicly available data sources, and I think our sense is it would be good to have a richer source of those. And obviously you need the data to be available in each and every one of your areas of operation. Yeah. So if you're a business with 80 countries, you probably want to be covering most of those. Yeah. And that's not to say, I think, that you couldn't initially do some sort of top-down thinking. I don't think the only reaction should be to go from the starting point to I need several million data items and a very large black box to be developed. I think the first thing that you probably ought to be doing is trying to think through strategic implications. Which of my businesses are likely to be winners and losers? What's the sort of risk that I'm running, and what's the possible impact on my returns? Because I mean, I look at this through a risk-adjusted lens with my trustee hat on, and I'm seeking to understand: are there sectors where the level of risk is perhaps elevated or maybe elevated? And we ask ourselves the question, am I being compensated for that elevated risk? I think that's an important question for fund owners and asset owners. Equally, I think it's a really important question for boards of directors and senior management as they're making their own capital allocation decisions.
So within my asset base, there's some risks, and we should find ways to understand and get those disclosed to us better. Yeah. And then within the sort of opportunity space, there's a risk that I miss out, effectively. Absolutely. And so getting people to analyse that and interpret the underlying corporate behaviour is...
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you've been involved in discussions like many have, Nico, but I mean, you'll hear of asset owners thinking about structuring renewable mandates. There have been conversations around, well, what needs to be present for asset owners to be investing in confidence, yep, perhaps into infrastructure. And clearly, when you're making long-term infrastructure investment decisions, you need policy certainty. So almost that's a prerequisite. And I think that then brings into focus some sort of collaboration between government, between entrepreneurs who are going to see business opportunity, and the providers of debt and equity capital, because there's a commonality of interest, yep, from all those players, to be honest.
I wanted to turn to the voluntary nature of the disclosures, and I guess just thoughts from you as to how quickly, how widely you hope that could be adopted, and maybe what you see the role of institutions and actuaries in.
Yeah, so I think voluntary for me is I certainly believe that you probably need 2 or 3 years of experimentation is one way of describing it, but really to give companies an opportunity and asset owners an opportunity to think about this, to understand it, to find out what's going to work. I think beyond 3 years, and potentially you're looking at something moving into more of a mandatory space. But I am firmly of the view that I think it's quite difficult to make this mandatory today. I mean, our recommendations are not prescriptive, they're definitely couched in terms of encouragement and giving optionality. So what do I hope for 2017? I think 2 things. Well, first of all, strong encouragement from asset owners and fund managers on businesses to go on the front foot and voluntarily make these disclosures. Perhaps the easiest thing a company can do is to make a public statement that it intends to adopt the recommendations of the task force, and then to provide perhaps a little roadmap as to how it might then seek to bring those disclosures into its public filings. As I said earlier, that might begin with a disclosure around governance, the risk management piece, and some high-level strategic articulation of that. We are mindful that there'll be companies out there who are concerned about their public liability issues, particularly in the US and in the UK. We have the strategic report, so these disclosures could initially sit in a strategic report, which might be quite a natural place for them to be. We would like to see the asset owners again supporting this with the fund managers, and that means getting this on the trustee board agenda and actually committing to implement the task force recommendations, because asset owners report to beneficiaries, so they could make these disclosures in their company accounts. I think there are important questions about what information you share with your defined contribution beneficiaries, both through the default fund, indeed the range of DC options that you provide your beneficiaries. I think there is some really encouraging signs of innovation from the fund management industry with product innovation. As you know, HSBC moved its DC default fund in November to Legal & General's Future World Fund. That's one example. We've seen a couple of others, but they're small steps, and I think there are real opportunities for innovation and for real momentum to be built. So I think for the investment consulting industry, for the actuaries, just lots of opportunities here.
Yeah.
There's a really big education need for workshops. You need to get people in the room talking to each other. You need conferences, but you need to guide your clients. Most of your asset owners will feel understandably a little bit apprehensive about this, but they don't need to go from where they are today to fully fledged carbon footprinting of their portfolios. They can. That's one technique. It's not the only one, but to begin the conversation, to get trustee engagement, to think through this. I'd also make the observation that I think I'm correct that if you're investing in the FTSE 100 as an equity index, close to 40% of that index has high carbon emissions. So even though you may not have talked about this on your trustee board, by virtue of investing in the FTSE 100 on a passive indexation basis, you're actually making a positive tilt towards high carbon.
Yeah.
So I would encourage you to reflect on that and to think through whether or not the risk and return dynamics justify that.
Right. Yeah. So I think we've got one other question that's come in through the chat, and it sort of links to a comment that I was going to make.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting and fascinating how the work you're doing, and maybe the already existing work by corporates, is to take the risk process out of that maybe risk board and much more into corporate strategy and much more thinking about what this climate risk means for many different features of the business in the future. You commented that some sectors have been looking at the 2-degree scenario and have been working kind of well with that. Which sectors have given your gold stars in?
Well, I'm not sure I give gold stars. I'm fairly parsimonious with my stars, actually, Nick. I think the obvious sectors that are early movers on thinking through this and making some public disclosure are oil and gas, energy, so the energy utilities, mining would be another one. I think also if you look at the car manufacturers, I was looking at one of those the other day. I mean, they are clearly thinking through their product range. Obvious issues such as the market's appetite and the regulatory appetite for diesel cars versus electric or hybrids, and then thinking through where they lay down their investment money. And that product mix. I mean, no one's saying that they'll go from where they are today to stopping manufacturing diesel or petrol vehicles tomorrow, but they are on a journey, and they probably do think they're going to land in a place where the mix between electric and hybrid vehicles and petrol and diesel vehicles will be substantially different. So a number of those disclosures, I looked at one prominent German manufacturer. They published a really interesting description of their thought process around this and how they were actually seeking to redesign their entire product range. So there are examples out there. We would like to see, and this may be the next phase of our work, we would like to see examples being gathered, because I think it's really helpful to see examples of good disclosure. There are examples in the oil and gas industry of some interesting disclosures in sustainability reports, and indeed in other areas. And I think we're not in the business of criticizing. We're in the business of encouraging and supporting disclosure to get this information out into the market so that shareholders can engage with companies, really then focus on what works to then raise the overall bar, if you like. I would say, though, that I think entirely narrative disclosures are good to a point, but you do need some numbers around it. And with areas such as scenario analysis, it is really important to share with the market the critical assumptions that you're making. I think if you don't do that, it really makes it hard for the market then to form an independent judgment around those decisions.
So a much bigger role, I think, for investment managers to go out and first of all, ask for disclosures, and then to do that interpretation for the clients. And it sounds like, so in those kind of long-term capital planning sectors, particularly with their sort of high carbon, that message is starting to come.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Nico. That the obvious lens that we're seeking to is we're saying to a company, think about your investment time horizon. So if you're making investments which are, say, 15 years, you should be thinking through the possible impact of climate risk over that 15-year time horizon. And there are clearly industries that make investment decisions which are well beyond that. In our discussion through outreach with companies, which we did a lot of, it is clear that best in class thinks about the nationally determined contributions, thinks about government policy and how that might tighten, and potential adverse physical impacts, water shortage, etc., etc. And that's really the lens which we'd like the company to talk to the market through. We're not trying to impose a different timescale from that investment horizon.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Russell. Thank you very much for speaking to us about a topic that I'm sure we'll be hearing much more of in the future. But for those actuaries who have first come across the task force work, that was a fantastic summary. I think we'll be filling the actuarial inbox for some time to come. So I'm going to draw a close to the webinar there. Before I leave you, if I could remind you to look for the Resource and Environment newsletter and make sure you sign up to that. We regularly get told as being the most interesting newsletter of all the practice variables. I don't have to make that up, that's absolutely true. So do sign into that. It will keep you abreast of all of these different issues and also promote volunteering opportunities to really help us move the profession forward on this issue. Final comment is to say that we'll be sending a link to the webinar to everyone who has registered, and it will also be made available on our website. So with that, thank you once more, Russell, for speaking to us, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.